So thank you for having me here on Larrakia land to present some findings from our NATSIHEC ministerial report on increasing the academic workforce in Australian universities. It was a big and challenging experience to do this alongside Professor Stephen Larkin when he was here at the Office of the Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Leadership, and also with my very esteemed colleague Kim. And who else was involved at the time? Leslie Gibbon. And I think that was our little team.
And then the University of Newcastle.
That's true. So then the University of Newcastle collaborated with us, and we formed one part of three, I guess, focuses for this ministerial report. So this is an overview of our presentation. We're going to give you a little bit of the context and background, which you probably know a lot about, but we're standing out a little bit in that we're talking about the Indigenous academic workforce rather than students, but you can probably appreciate that those two things have a strong relationship in themselves. We'll then talk to you about our research methods, our analysis, and we're really going to focus on our qualitative findings, and then give you some sort of key findings from the report and then what we think after going through that journey ourselves.
Thank you. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think you probably are just about policied out today. But just to make reference to this foreword, which is in the front of the Universities Australia Indigenous Strategy, which, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned this morning, is the first time that Universities Australia has, put this on the national agenda in such a way. And it's all about working together better. And then a little bit more about the background to the report. So, as Sarah mentioned, it was commissioned back in 2016. We commenced late 2016 and it went over into 2017. The commission went to the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium, and there were the three aspects of that research. So there was looking at whole of university approaches to Indigenous education, looking at building the academic workforce, building the higher education workforce, of which we essentially focused on building the academic workforce, although obviously there's crossovers and recommendations around the professional workforce, and looking at the STEM, Indigenous participation in STEM, and how we can improve that over time. The full report, 200 odd pages, so a bit of coffee table reading for you. You can access online.
It's interesting, I'm sure.
Yeah. You can access online through the NATSIHEC website.
So part of the report was trying to get an idea of the workforce profile, and at the time we had access to the Higher Education Information Management Scheme data, and also the IES, the Indigenous Education Statements. So both of those data sets, to be honest, are like comparing apples and oranges. And it was really, really difficult to get a true sense of what the data was telling us. In the report, we've got a table that kind of breaks down the limitations. So, for example, the purpose of the two data sets are entirely different. In fact, the IES one, I think, has been superseded by a totally different way of reporting to gain that funding. So this is a little bit old, but it's the best data that we've got over the years. Then the data collection methods are completely different. One is a snapshot of time, another one is reported over an academic year. There's complete inconsistencies in the templates of the IES statements. So, one uni will do it one way and then another uni will do it another way. So even in the box of oranges, there's some mandarins. The person who's collecting the data is different, so there's not consistency, and even things like Indigenous status is entirely, it is declared in a different way. So with the HIMES data, the higher education one, it's recorded through self-identification on employment records, whereas the IES could be a combination of that and also publicly known or publicly identified. So the person collecting the IES data anecdotally, you know, would have a good sense of who the Indigenous staff members were and could report on that, as opposed to someone in a HR department flicking through bits of paper and going, oh yeah, that box is ticked or not ticked. And also they reported on the actual staff members in a different way. So in the HIMES data set, you know, they looked at full-time and fractional full-time, whereas the IES also included casual, academic, professional and casual permanent staff. So really, I'm setting this scene that this is quite limited in many ways. But drawing on the HIMES data from 2001 to 2015, which we had available at the time, we can demonstrate that Indigenous academics are really poorly represented in Australian universities in the workforce, and that nationally percentages fall well short of the target parity rate, which at the time was around 2.7%. And that little star up the top there is kind of where we would like the bottom line to be. So a massive difference. And even the parity rate is open to debate and is contentious. So the parity rate that's recommended by the Brent report was taking the number of Indigenous people of workforce age, so if I'm correct, I think that was 15 to 65-year-olds as a percentage, which is different from the percentage of Indigenous people for the whole population. But it doesn't account for differences in workforce readiness, morbidity, all these other things that we know are very different for that cohort in the population. So in 2015, there were actually 360 Indigenous full-time academics, and to meet the current target parity rate for that year, we would need another 816 people to be employed. While the total number remains very, very low compared to the non-Indigenous academic workforce, there is an encouraging slow trend of it increasing. And also there was great variance between institutions. So some institutions employed more than 20 academics, where there were some that had none. I think I'm talking about this one too. So the majority of Indigenous academics are female, which, you know, sitting here today, I heard that coming out in the stats in other ways, like the students that are enrolled who are completing, more predominantly female. And certainly as a proportion, they've been increasing as well. So male participation is dropping off and female participation is increasing. And all of the data that we've got suggests that academics are proportionally underrepresented at senior levels above B grade, and there's quite a distinct bottleneck at level B. And for those of you who aren't experts in how academics are classified for their workplace duties, generally to get beyond level B you need a PhD, which means that at some stage you've gone on the journey as a high degree by research student. Again, parallels to other bits of information that we're talking about. So that's a complete tiny little snapshot, and again, as Kim said, we refer you to our big meaty report for more information on the profile of the workforce. Now we're going to talk to you a little bit about our qualitative research that we did. We wanted to find out what was happening in successful universities for Indigenous academics. So we identified 3 universities that we could use as case studies that were known for their successes in recruiting and retaining Indigenous academics. And we used Eileen Morton Robertson's book, report, on Stony Ground, that gave you know, a ranking of how well governance was instituted in the university, with the idea that maybe if all of that was happening well, then the staff members would be happy. So we went to 3 of those universities, and they exemplified regional, outer regional and a city campus location. And we really used an ethnographic approach. So we were interested in people's meaning and what they thought of the experience that was happening for them. So we went and visited the university, so we did 3 site visits, and we were actually in the work environment. We made some written notes about what we could see and what was going on, and then we did some semi-structured interviews, and that included Indigenous staff and non-Indigenous staff in executive level roles. So we didn't want to know what the average staff member thought. We wanted the people in powerful positions, and of course Indigenous people themselves, because we were privileging that perspective. We coupled that with a desktop review of publicly available institutional policies and government documents to try and get a real sense of what was working and why. And then you probably want to know how we analysed that data. We got all of the data together, so our fieldwork notes, our interview transcripts, and all of our policy auditing, and we just did a really simple thematic analysis that was led by our Indigenous colleagues. And these are the findings.
Thank you. So as Sarah said, we did the 3 very different universities, so we did 3 very different universities, different in many ways, different in size, location in terms of city, metro, regional or remote, and different in the number of Indigenous academics. However, despite their differences, there were really clear themes that came through when we collaborated and cross-checked all the data. And these are 5 of the emerging themes. These are not in priority order, but these are the top 5. I'll let you read them as well. So we know that over the last decade there's been an increase in strategies and policies that we've talked about many today, but mechanisms and measures for implementing strategic employment aspirations are somewhat lacking. There was a general consensus that the universities need to move from a philosophical position of Indigenous employment as an equity issue to one of understanding the strategic demand and the value of Indigenous employment. Theme number 2, workforce supply and demand. This was a really interesting quote, number 1, I thought, where a very experienced academic spoke about her particular journey and how if she hadn't have had a senior mentor, who in her case happened to be a non-Indigenous researcher, if she hadn't have had that senior mentor to advocate on her behalf, she would never have got to where she was. She said you need someone to open that door for you, and that person has to be on the inside to open the door. And she's talking in particular reference to a research grant that she was able to get that then sort of launched her, her academic career and helped her with her career progression. And the last one also sort of touches back on what we've also talked about today in terms of the structure of positions for Indigenous academics, which we know has increased over the last 10 years in terms of the high-level Vice-Chancellor level roles across the country. But as the data showed, most of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics are still down at level A and B, and this person identified that, there's a few rungs in the ladder missing in terms of people's capacity and opportunity for professional development and progression. So theme 3, racism and discrimination.
So a lot of our interview data still reported that people were experiencing racism and discrimination in their workplace. Sometimes this wasn't, overt. It was more subtle things that were experienced, grabbing a coffee or a glass of water and hearing what colleagues were saying. Other reports were more systematic, looking at sort of the epistemological racism that many Indigenous people feel engaging in the Western Academy. And I guess using more of a strengths-based approach, universities were also seen as a very positive place to have mature debates and discussions about racism and discrimination. Do you need a chance to read those quotes? Were you there? You're all speed readers?
So theme number 4, university leadership. So sort of two-edged there. So talking about, most people acknowledged that it had to be from the Vice-Chancellor down that leadership was shown, and that it needed to be genuine, authentic leadership from the Vice-Chancellor that was, commonly reiterated so that everyone was aware. Public championing, demanding and monitoring as well. And then the other academic highlighting again that we need to see more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in those positions as mentors and for the young ones coming through, so they know that there's, people have made it to those levels. What was interesting was so each of the 3 universities had a Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Indigenous education, and all the staff interviewed were really well aware of that role and the complexity of that role, from sort of academic level A's right through to the other senior academics. So I think there's wide recognition that role is important, but it's also very complex and carries a heavy load. They also saw that as well as having the seniors to mentor younger and emerging Indigenous academics, that there was, that there needed to be senior Aboriginal academics across the university. So they saw beyond that Pro-Vice-Chancellor or that office that I think we've talked about that today in terms of ghettoising Aboriginal studies and in Indigenous education, but to have leaders in other key discipline areas, faculties and operational areas, and that would be the only way the university could service their growing aspirations for Indigenous education. In terms of leadership, staff also were clear about what they saw was important in their leaders, whether that be non-Indigenous or Indigenous leaders, and that was that they did need to have the technical skills for their role, but they also needed to have interpersonal soft skills up there as a priority in terms of relationship building and relationship management. And last but not least, theme 5, Indigenous territory in the academy. So we've put this in quotation marks because it actually sounds like a simple word, but it has many meanings. And we're sort of claiming all the meanings for the purpose of this theme from the physical space and the physical territory that Indigenous education has on campus, through to more of an intellectual understanding and valuing of Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies in what is a Western construct of academia. So there was wide recognition that the Indigenous Higher Education Unit provided physical and symbolic representations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander presence, and these places were widely valued by Indigenous academics from their experience as a student themselves and their experience as staff. They conversely also identified that there needed to be more of this across the campus, so not only have for example, the flag, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flag flying at the front of the unit, but have it flying at the front of the university. That's sort of in its simplest form, but it's just demonstrating that staff were well aware that often it was only in the Aboriginal unit that you had that sort of visibility of culture. And they saw that as really important for bringing in students, but also important for all visitors to campus, whether they be international visitors, students and community. All of the academics, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics, whether they were employed within the Indigenous Higher Education Unit or whether they were employed within a faculty, suggested that heads of schools and faculties need to step up to increasing Indigenous employment within their own area and create Indigenous friendly work environments if they want to demonstrate that commitment.
Sure. So, in summary, the report, has lots of dense recommendations, that many of them about better collaboration between universities, governments and peak organisational bodies, but some that I think are relevant perhaps to this audience is that, there is widespread recognition of the importance of having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics in the higher education workforce, but it's just not happening. There's not enough Indigenous academics and it's well below parity, and it doesn't seem to correspond with the trends of, encouraging trends of increasing student HDR completions. We're not seeing that transition into the workforce. We have seen the creation and the increase in numbers of high-level executive Indigenous academics, but really the majority of the female women academics that identify as being Indigenous are stuck at level B. It's a real bottleneck. And I think that disproportionate difference between the sexes suggests that there does need to be sort of some gendered strategies to recruit men into the space, but also to then help promote the women through that bottleneck. I think too that what we're saying here has been said before in other nuanced ways that is reported in the literature. We're not saying anything new. And that certainly a policy background that is supportive of Indigenous people and their aspirations is crucial, but it doesn't result in the recruitment and retention of academics who are Indigenous alone. And as Kim was saying, the physical and social environments make major impacts on how people feel about coming to work and staying at work.
And so just to finish up, what can we do better? So just some practical ideas. Existing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff be targeted for retention and professional development. Sarah mentioned already some gendered strategies are required to increase the number of male Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics. The pipeline of Indigenous academics needs to really happen. So targeting existing students to encourage them onto HDR and into academic careers. Recognising that the social and intellectual capital provided by students and staff is crucial to success. And also a recognition that many Indigenous academics are carrying large loads, not just their own personal goals and aspirations and those of their families, but often those of their respective community and communities. And just in closing, I'd just like to read one more quote. This is by a teaching-focused academic. She said, "Any Indigenous person who gets to work in higher education has an advantage because they've proven they can manoeuvre in the Western education space and they have the added bonus of this indigeneity, this Aboriginal centre, this extra added knowledge. I don't think that gets recognised enough. It doesn't even get spoken about. These academics should be valued because they actually have extra added dimensions and skills."